12 armed men entered that forest. None of them came out. The only survivor was a woman they had been sent to kill. Wounded, soaking wet, alone in -18-degree cold. 7 bullets left. A shoulder that worked at 60%. And a target on her back signed by the one man she had ever trusted completely. 3 years earlier, her commander had declared her dead. He signed the paperwork himself. She let him believe it, because she was building something. Quietly, carefully. For 37 months in the shadows, no name, no record, no trace. She had been assembling the evidence that would bring down not just him, but the United States Senator protecting everything he'd done. Tonight was the night it all came due. 12 men. 1 woman. Frozen river she crossed twice. Once to survive, once to finish it. And at a radio station 10 kilometers away, a 68-year-old retired ranger sat completely still in front of a dead frequency, a channel that had been silent for 3 years, and waited. He had never stopped believing she was alive. He was right. This is her story. The call came in at 2:47 in the morning. Not a voice, not words, just a single pulse on the emergency frequency. 1 beep, then silence. At the Forward Coordination Station, a converted ranger post on the eastern edge of the Bitterroot Range in Montana. 6 monitors glowed in the dark. Weather feeds, topographic overlays, satellite thermal imaging that showed nothing useful, just trees, snow, cold that had settled into the valley like something permanent. Garrett Cole leaned forward in his chair. He was 68 years old. Retired Army Ranger. His hands were large and knuckle-heavy from decades of cold weather and physical work. Face had the kind of lines you earn, not from age alone, but from carrying things for a long time without putting them down. He'd been brought in as a terrain consultant 3 days ago. He knew this stretch of Montana the way some men know their own living rooms. Every ridge, every drainage corridor, every place the river ran shallow enough to cross in winter without losing your footing. He pressed the headset tighter against his ear. 1 pulse. That was all. The protocol for that signal was simple. It meant, I am alive. I cannot speak. Do not search for me yet. The communications officer sitting across the room was a young man named Teller. 26 years old, maybe 27. Sharp. Careful. He looked up from his panel with the specific expression of someone who had just found something in a database that confused him. Sir, his voice was measured. That's the ridgeline frequency. Garrett didn't answer right away. He was looking at the topographic map spread across the table in front of him. His eyes moved along the eastern slope, down the river corridor, to the place where the valley pinched narrow before opening up again toward the old logging roads beyond the tree line. Ridgeline 7, Teller said. He scrolled through the frequency log. That designation hasn't been active in. He stopped, checked the record again, checked it a 3rd time. 3 years, sir. Garrett said nothing. He reached over and turned up the audio monitor feed. Static. Wind across the receiver. The low, persistent hiss of distance and cold. And then, faint, underneath everything else, the sound of water moving over rocks. He knew that sound. He had grown up with that sound. He had taken his daughter to the upper fork of this river when she was 8 years old. And she had sat on the bank and listened to it for a long time without saying anything, and then she had said, "It sounds like it knows where it's going." He had thought about that sentence 100 times since. He sat very still now and listened to the same water in a monitor feed at 3 in the morning and felt something settle in his chest that had not been settled in 3 years. Let me back up and tell you what had happened in the 6 hours before that signal. A team of 6 operators had entered the Bitterroot at nightfall. Their mission was classified at a level that kept most of the coordination station staff from knowing its full scope. What they knew. A woman named Dr. Eleanor Marsh had been reported missing 4 days earlier. 61 years old, retired forensic scientist with a federal background. The official story was a hiking accident in difficult terrain. The unofficial story was different. Eleanor Marsh had not been in any accident. She had spent the last 8 months quietly assembling a body of financial records, a flash drive and a paper backup, documenting a pattern of misconduct inside the defense tracking system. Not small things. Not bureaucratic irregularities. A systematic network of payments, routed through carefully constructed intermediaries, connecting a series of military procurement decisions to private money that had no legitimate reason to be there. The records named names. Someone wanted them gone. Someone wanted Eleanor Marsh gone with them. The 6-man team that went in that night was supposed to reach her at a location 12 kilometers into the backcountry, a cabin near the upper fork of the river. They had full equipment, thermal imaging, a clean extraction plan with 2 contingency routes. They had not come back. At 11:40 p.m., The team leader's tracker went offline. At 11:52, a second tracker died. By midnight, all 6 were dark. No distress signals, no last transmissions. Not a single word. The coordination station had been running on controlled panic since then. Teller had been on his panel for 3 straight hours, cycling through frequencies, trying to raise anyone. Duty officer, a man named Pressman who sweated even in cold rooms, had made 4 phone calls in the last 90 minutes, each one to someone with more authority than the last. Nobody had good answers. And then, at 2:47 a.m., single pulse had come in on a frequency that was supposed to be dead. Garrett stood up slowly. His knees ached. They always ached in Montana winters. Now, a combination of old injuries and weather that he'd long since made his peace with. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkness beyond the glass. Snow had been falling for hours. Not the dramatic kind, no wind, no driving sheets. Just steady, quiet accumulation. The kind of snow that settles onto everything evenly and muffles the world until it feels like the whole landscape is holding its breath. The trees were white. The access road was white. The mountains beyond were invisible in the dark. Garrett knew exactly where they were. He had memorized this geography over 30 years of returning to it, and the knowledge lived in him now at a level below thought. "Sir," Teller spoke carefully, choosing his words. "The Ridgeline designation. I'm looking at the program records. All personnel under that classification are listed as. I know what they're listed as." His voice was level, quiet, the voice of a man who had spent decades learning that keeping your voice level didn't mean you weren't feeling anything. It just meant you'd had enough practice at not letting what you felt interfere with what needed to be done. "Should I flag the signal to the main coordination channel?" Garrett turned from the window. "Log it as unverified contact on the Ridgeline frequency," he said. "Don't route it upward yet." Teller hesitated. He was a rule follower by nature. Garrett had read that in him within an hour of meeting him. Good instinct, usually. "Not always, sir. Protocol requires." "I know what protocol requires." Garrett sat back down. He pulled the topographic map closer. His finger traced the river corridor from the upper fork down to the eastern drainage. Slowly, the way you'd trace a sentence you were reading for meaning, not just information. "Give me 15 minutes before we go up the chain." "That's all I'm asking." Teller looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the panel. Then he nodded once and went back to work. Garrett stared at the map. His finger stopped. It rested on a section of the eastern bank where the terrain pushed up into a long natural rock formation. 8, maybe 10 meters above the waterline. 3-sided shelter, good sight lines to the north and west, protected from the prevailing wind direction, the kind of position a trained person would identify, the kind of position he had pointed out once, on a summer trip up here, to a 19-year-old who was learning to read terrain the way her father did, not as an academic exercise, but as a living document. If you were up here and something went wrong, he had said, "Where would you go?" She had looked at the landscape for about 30 seconds. Then she had pointed to exactly that rock formation. "There," she had said, "sight lines, wind cover. The river gives you sound masking and a water source. You can see anyone coming from 3 directions before they see you." He had looked at her and felt that particular pride that doesn't know quite what to do with itself. "That's right," he'd said. "That's exactly right." She had been in the river for 4 minutes. Not floating, not swept along by the current, submerged to the shoulders, stationary, pressed against the downstream face of a large granite boulder. The rock broke the current around her and, more importantly, interrupted her thermal signature. Anything scanning the bank from above would read the boulder's mass, not hers. Her name was Reva Cole, 26 years old. The water temperature was 31 degrees Fahrenheit. 1 degree above the point where rivers stop being rivers and become ice. The kind of cold that gets into your joints in the first 60 seconds and becomes a kind of white noise in the brain by the 3rd minute, not numbing exactly, but insistent. A presence you have to continuously decide not to let run the show. She didn't make a sound. That was the thing you noticed first, if you were somehow watching. Not the stillness, anyone can force themselves to be still. It was the quality of it. The absence of the small involuntary movements that cold pulls out of most people. The held breath, the flinch, the micro-tremors that start in the extremities and work inward, not that. She had a particular relationship with physical discomfort. Not a love of it. She wasn't that kind of person, and she'd always had limited patience for the type who performs suffering as a form of identity. But somewhere in her early 20s, she had done the work of learning to locate the line between pain that meant damage and pain that meant discomfort. Cold water at this temperature for this duration meant discomfort, She could manage discomfort. She counted in breaths, not seconds. Slow, controlled exhale. Slow inhale. Approximately 6 seconds per cycle. She was on breath 29 when she heard what she'd been waiting for. Footsteps on the eastern bank. 2 sets. Moving north. She waited 3 more complete breath cycles. Then she moved. She came out of the water on the downstream side of the boulder. Low, controlled, body angled away from the sight lines she'd already mapped before she'd gone in. She didn't stand immediately. She crouched against the base of the rock and let the first full impact of the cold air hit her wet clothing. She breathed through the drop in perceived temperature and cataloged herself. This was habit. Automatic. The kind of self-assessment that had become reflexive through years of practice. Left shoulder, entry and exit wound, both clean, packed tight with a section of base layer fabric she'd cut away 2 hours earlier using her field knife. Range of motion roughly 60%. Enough. Not comfortable, but enough. Right hand. 2 knuckles bruised, third metacarpal possibly cracked, grip functional. Core temperature. Lower than ideal. She estimated she had somewhere between 75 minutes and 2 hours before it became a real problem. That was enough time if she moved. Ammunition. 7 rounds remaining in the primary rifle. 11 in the sidearm. She looked up the bank. The 2 sets of footprints were continuing north, their tracks clear in the new snow. Heavy treaded boots, close stride spacing. The gait of men moving with intention but without urgency, purpose not pursuit. They were running a patrol route. They weren't reacting to anything. They didn't know she was here. She took that fact and filed it carefully. Then she began to move. The sequence she used to cover open ground looked almost mechanical to anyone who had ever watched her do it. It wasn't the fluid, improvised movement of someone reacting to a situation. It was deliberate. Weight transfer, pause, scan, move. A pattern that had been drilled into her until it ran below the level of conscious choice. She covered 40 meters of exposed riverbank in just over 2.5 minutes without producing a sound that carried more than 6 feet in any direction. At the top of the bank, she pressed herself against the base of a large Douglas fir and oriented. The rock formation her father had shown her was 12 meters to her right. She reached it in under 2 minutes. From the top, 8 meters above the valley floor, 3-sided, wind-sheltered. She could see the full northern approach, the western tree line, a long section of the river below, and scattered through the trees to the north and northeast. Points of light she counted carefully. 11 distinct fire sources, small, controlled. Men who were cold and had built fires small enough to be defensible, plus the 2 who had walked north. 13 total. She lay flat on the stone and let the cold of it work through her wet clothing and built a picture. This was the part of the work that didn't show up in any official assessment of her capabilities. Not in her personnel file, the one that was now marked killed in action. Not in the training evaluations that Drexler had written on her over 14 months. Not in any debrief or after-action report. The thinking, slow construction of a full situational picture from fragments, sources, sound patterns, track spacing. The direction a fire was built relative to the wind, assembled into something coherent the way a careful reader assembles meaning from a complicated text. She had been doing this since childhood. Long before anyone trained her, she had always been able to read a room. Field, a group of people in a complicated situation. It was a form of attention, the same form her father had modeled for her, in a different register. Over the course of her entire life, the forest was just a very large, very dangerous room. She read it. There is a particular kind of mentor that exists in specialized military training, not a teacher exactly. Not a commanding officer in the conventional sense. Something older than both. Someone who takes a person apart, methodically, deliberately, great skill, and reassembles them into something more capable than they were before. Owen Drexler had been that person for Reva Cole. He was 54 years old, 31 years in naval special warfare. The last 12 as a senior instructor in advanced reconnaissance and sniper programs. If you asked the people who had trained under him, and there were hundreds, across multiple generations of operators, most of them would say some version of the same thing. He was the best tactical mind I ever encountered. Nothing wasted, nothing improvised that didn't need to be. He saw the whole picture before you'd identified the frame. He was also, and had been for approximately 8 years, a man with a private arrangement. The arrangement was careful, constructed to survive scrutiny. Payments routed through 3 intermediary layers into consulting structures that existed on paper with enough legitimacy to pass surface-level review. What he provided in exchange was information, not the kind that gets soldiers killed directly. He'd told himself that early on and mostly believed it. Mission timing, program vulnerability assessments, procurement details, kind of information that helped certain contractors stay ahead of their competition in ways that were difficult to trace back to a single source. He had been very careful. He had made, in Riva Cole, the error of producing someone too capable to be managed. She had not been looking for what she found. That was the essential irony. She hadn't run an investigation. She hadn't followed a hunch about him. She had been working a separate tasking, a communications security audit, and encountered a single anomalous data point, a mission timeline that had moved through a channel it had no reason to be in. She had done what she always did. She pulled the thread. 6 weeks later, she had a documented pattern that connected Drexler to 7 years of payments, 4 compromised program assessments, and 2 operations that had gone wrong in ways that had never been adequately explained. She had reported it through the proper internal channel. 48 hours after that report landed, her service file had been updated, but dessassion, training accident, remote location, no remains recovered. She had been declared dead by the man who had spent 14 months building her into what she was. The notification had reached her through a single encrypted message from a records clerk she had never met in person, someone who had taken a significant personal risk to send it. The message had been 4 words. They closed your file. She had understood immediately. She had run, and then she had stopped running, and she had started doing something else entirely. The 3 years between that moment and this one were not years that would make a straightforward story. She had lived on the margins of the documented world, cash-only work in places where people didn't ask for much in the way of background. A 6-month stretch doing wildfire spotting in eastern Oregon, using skills that translated cleanly and a name that didn't appear in any system. A winter in Wyoming. 14 months in the Pacific Northwest that she thought of, later, as her research period, when the parallel documentation project had taken real shape, when the work of building an airtight case from sources that couldn't be connected to a ghost had become her primary occupation. She had not contacted her father. This was the decision that cost her the most. Not the physical difficulty of what she was doing, not the isolation, which was real but manageable for someone built the way she was. The silence toward the one person who had, more than anyone else, shaped everything she was. She understood why it was necessary. If Garrett Cole believed his daughter was alive, he would look for her. He was not a man who sat with uncertainty when action was available to him. He would look, and people connected to Drexler would eventually notice, and Garrett Cole would become a vulnerability that someone would decide to address. She would not do that to him. She would not put him in the position of being used against her. So she had let him grieve. She had made the choice clearly and deliberately, and she had lived with it every single day for 37 months. She was still living with it now, lying on a cold rock in the dark, building a picture of 13 enemy positions, with a wound in her shoulder and 7 rounds in her rifle. The weight of it was not something she had put down. She had simply learned to carry it and work at the same time. The event that had brought her to Montana, to this specific night, this specific operation, had begun 14 days earlier. Eleanor Marsh had reached out through a dead drop protocol that Riva had established years ago for exactly this purpose. A layered anonymous communication channel, accessible to a small number of people who knew it existed, designed to survive the kind of scrutiny that might come if things went wrong. Marsh's message had been short. I have the full financial record. Payments, routing, names, including the name above Drexler. I have been told you are still operating. I hope that is true. I need someone who understands what this material represents and what it will take to make it stick. I also need someone who understands what will happen to me if the wrong people find it first. I am told you are that person. Riva had read it twice. Then she had started planning. She had not planned for a 6-man extraction team to be in the operational area. That was a complication she had not built into her timeline, significant enough that she had spent the first 4 hours after learning about it deciding whether to abort and reset. She had decided not to abort, because Drexler's decision to move on Marsh, now, this level of force, meant one thing clearly. He knew the documents were real, and he knew they were close to becoming uncontainable. He was scared. Scared people with resources move fast and stop being careful. A scared Drexler was a more dangerous Drexler. It was also a Drexler who might make mistakes. She had adjusted her timeline and gone in. Back at the coordination station, Garrett Cole had been on a private call for 14 minutes. He was not using the station's communication system. He was using a personal satellite phone, speaking to a man named Walt Sudbury, former Ranger Intelligence, currently operating under a title that described itself as Defense Analysis Consulting and meant something considerably more specific to the people who knew him. Walt Sudbury owed Garrett Cole 2 favors of significant weight. Tonight Garrett was collecting one of them, the Ridgeline program, Garrett said. He kept his voice low and even. Teller was across the room, conscientiously not listening. Tell me what actually happened when it closed. A pause. The measured pause of a man deciding how much he can say and through what channel. That program's records are sealed above my clearance level, Walt said. I'm not asking for records. I'm asking what you know. Another pause. Shorter. The closure was not clean, Walt said finally. There were personnel decisions made at the end of it that were not standard. People were removed from the active roster in ways that weren't consistent with normal separation procedures. Removed how? Various ways. Some administrative, some. Walt stopped. The senior instructor on the program had final authority over personnel designations. Drexler. You know that name? Garrett's hand tightened slightly on the phone. He knew the name. He had heard it first from Riva in one of the last real conversations they'd had before her final deployment. She had been describing her training, and she had said, with a specific tone he'd never quite heard from her before, tone that was equal parts respect and wariness. The man who runs the program is named Drexler. He's hard, but he's fair. He doesn't waste words. Garrett had filed the name. He had never imagined it would come back to him like this. Drexler is coordinating tonight's operation, Garrett said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, Walt said one word. Very quiet. Garrett sat with that for a moment. The extraction team that went dark, he said. Was it possible they were sent in knowing the position was compromised? The silence on the line lasted long enough that Garrett checked to see if the call had dropped. That's a question I can't answer on this line, Walt said. Which was, Garrett knew, its own kind of answer. Garrett said, last question. The Ridgeline personnel who were removed. Any of them, is there any possibility that a removal was documented as something other than what it actually was? A very long pause. It's possible, Walt said carefully. In cases where someone needed to disappear from the active record for reasons that were, he chose his next word with precision. Administrative. How would that look? Garrett asked. On paper. It might look like a training fatality, Walt said. In a remote location. Without recoverable remains, Garrett closed his eyes. He sat that way for 3 seconds. Then he opened them. Thank you, Walt, he said. He ended the call. Set the satellite phone down on the table beside the topographic map. His hands were steady. He was aware of Teller watching him from across the room with the careful peripheral attention of a young professional who senses that something significant is happening, but doesn't have enough information to know what. Garrett looked at the map. He looked at the rock formation on the eastern bank. He picked up the coordination station handset and pressed the transmit key once. Standard acknowledgement pattern. The old one. The one he and his daughter had built together during a camping trip in these same mountains when she was 16 years old. Half-jokingly, he had thought at the time. A private code between a father and a daughter who both knew, in their separate ways, that the world was more complicated than it appeared. He waited 38 seconds. 2 pulses came back. I hear you. Stand by. He set the handset down very carefully. Outside, the snow was still falling. The mountains were still invisible in the dark. The river was still running under ice somewhere out in the forest, moving toward wherever it was going with the uncomplicated certainty of water that knows its own course. Garrett Cole sat in a pool of monitor light and breathed and waited, sir. Teller said quietly, Do you want me to start waking up the chain of command? Garrett thought about it. Not yet, he said. Give it a little longer. Teller nodded. They sat in the quiet together, the old man and the young one, while the night held everything it knew about the dark. There are things a parent understands about their child that exist entirely outside of logic or evidence, not mystical things. Not anything you'd have difficulty defending if pressed. Practical things. The specific sound of a particular footstep in a hallway. The exact quality of a silence that means one thing when it comes from a stranger, and something completely different when it comes from someone you've known since before they knew themselves. The small behavioral signatures, the way a hand moves, specific rhythm of a particular kind of breathing, the angle of a head when attention has shifted inward, that accumulate over years of close observation until they become as readable as language. Garrett Cole had spent 68 years paying attention. He had been paying attention on the morning a doctor placed a 7-pound, 2-ounce infant daughter into his arms. And he looked down at this small, complete person and felt the full weight of what it meant to love something entirely that you could never fully protect. He had been paying attention through 11 years of a daughter who asked better questions than most adults he knew, who had her mother's eyes and her mother's instinct for cutting to the center of a thing, who had, at 9 years old, learned to navigate by stars because she'd asked him to teach her, and then practiced until she was better at it than he was. He had been paying attention on the night before her first deployment. She had been 22, and she had cried once, briefly, and then dried her face with the back of her hand and said, "I'm good, Dad. I just needed to get it out now so I don't have to do it later." And he had understood that this was not weakness. It was exactly the opposite. He had been paying attention during 3 years of a grief that had no honest bottom to it, because the official story had always carried a quality he recognized: the smooth, surface-level coherence of a narrative that has been constructed rather than discovered. Facts lined up too neatly. The gaps were in the wrong places. The absence of remains had been explained with a readiness that suggested the explanation had been prepared in advance. He had never said any of this out loud. He was not a man who spoke about things he couldn't prove, but he had not believed it, not fully. Not in the place where the real believing happens. He thought about Sandra, his wife, Riva's mother. Gone since Riva was 11. Sandra had been a quiet woman with a precise mind and a deep impatience for anything that wasn't true. She had met Garrett when they were both 24. He was between deployments. She was finishing a graduate degree in environmental biology, and she had said to him, within the first hour of conversation, "I can't tell if you're the most honest person I've ever met or the most careful one." He had told her he hoped it was both. She had thought about that for a moment. Then she had said, "I think those might be the same thing." He had loved her completely for 17 years. After she died, he had taken Riva into these mountains, 9 months after the funeral. Just the two of them. 2-day pack trip up the western drainage to a ridge that took 3 hours to reach and offered a view of 3 valleys simultaneously. They hadn't talked about Sandra much on that trip, not directly. They had walked and made camp and cooked simple food over a small fire and watched the stars move, and on the morning of the second day had sat together on that ridge and watched a sunrise that came up in layers. First the light, then the color, then the warmth, over mountains that had been doing this exact thing every morning for millions of years. On the way down, his daughter had said quietly, "I understand now why you come here when things get hard." He had asked what she meant. She had looked at him with her mother's eyes, same shape, same color, same particular quality of directness, and said, "Because it doesn't try to fix it. It just keeps being what it is. It doesn't need you to be okay." She was 8 years old. He had stored that sentence and carried it for 18 years. He was carrying it now. The radio produced a sound, not a voice. A pattern, short and long pulses in a sequence that had no designation in any official communications manual. Code that existed only between the two of them, built during a camping trip when she was 16, during a conversation that had started as a game and ended as something more serious, the way conversations with Riva often did. He had not known, sitting around that fire when she was 16, that she was already building towards something that would take her far beyond anything he'd mapped for her. He had suspected it, maybe. Parents who are paying attention usually sense the shape of things before they can name them. He translated the pulse pattern without effort. It was as automatic as reading. The message was 4 words, 12, package secure. Waiting, he read it twice, 12. Sat with that number. He didn't know the specifics of what had happened in those trees tonight. He didn't know the sequence of events, the positions, the decisions that had been made in the dark. He knew only the number and what it implied, and the fact that his daughter was alive and had sent it to him from the other side of the forest. He didn't feel triumph. He had long since learned that triumph was a feeling that belonged to people who hadn't seen enough of what winning actually cost. He didn't feel horror either, or not only that. He felt something that lived underneath horror and triumph both, something quieter and older, a particular kind of awe that a parent sometimes reaches, usually late in life, when they finally understand fully that the person their child has become is beyond their complete comprehension, not because they failed to know them, but because they succeeded, because the person they raised grew into something with its own complete interior that no parent could ever entirely map. He was proud of her. He was also sitting in this room at 3 in the morning, aware of how much he had missed. 3 years of her life that he hadn't known she was living. 3 years of carrying whatever she had been carrying, alone for reasons she had calculated precisely, including, he now understood her reasons for letting him believe she was gone. She had done it to protect him. He had known her long enough to know that. She would have looked at the situation, mapped the vectors of danger, and made the cold determination that his not knowing was the version of things that kept him safest. She had been right. He hated that she had been right. He pressed the transmit key. He sent back the pattern that meant, "I read you. I'm here. Take your time." Then he sat still. Outside, the snow continued to fall. It covered the access road and the trees and the roof of the ranger post with the same unhurried evenness. It did not distinguish between important things and unimportant ones. It covered them all. Teller was watching his panel, stopped trying not to watch Garrett. He had figured out, in the way that perceptive young people figure things out, that something was happening here that was larger than the official scope of the evening, and he was managing his reaction to that knowledge with more composure than Garrett would have expected from someone his age. "Sir," Teller said. His voice was quiet. "Careful. The extraction team that went dark. 6 men?" He paused. "Are they? I don't know yet," Garrett said. Teller absorbed that. "And the asset?" he asked. "Marsh? Someone's getting her out," Garrett said. "That's what I know," Teller nodded. He turned back to his panel. His hands moved over the controls with the precise efficiency of someone who has found, in the mechanics of a task, a way to manage what they're feeling. Garrett recognized that. He had done the same thing for 50 years. In the forest, Riva had reached the outer edge of the holding position. She pressed against the rock face of the alcove and listened. One person inside the structure, moving slowly. The sounds of someone fatigued and cold, but still alert. The specific quality of movement that belongs to a person who has been waiting a long time in difficult conditions and has not allowed themselves to fully rest. She waited outside for 90 seconds, listening to the pattern of the movement inside. Then she knocked 2 times. The exact pattern she had watched the guard use 40 minutes ago. A pause, a voice. Older, female, measured, not afraid. The voice of someone who has been in difficult situations before and made a prior decision about how to behave in them. "I was beginning to wonder," Eleanor Marsh said through the door. Riva slid the bar back and opened it. The woman inside was 61 years old, wearing inadequate clothing for the temperature, with a bruise forming along her left jawline and the particular composure of someone who has decided to hold themselves together by will alone and is succeeding. "I got slowed down," Riva said. 12 reasons. Marsh looked at her. The wet clothing, the packed shoulder wound, the eyes that gave nothing away, and did the rapid assessment of an experienced professional. "You're Garrett Cole's daughter," she said. Riva looked at her. "He told you about me?" "He didn't have to. You look exactly like him when you're trying not to show what you're thinking." Marsh allowed herself the smallest version of a tired smile. "He doesn't know you're alive." "He does now," Riva said. She held out her hand. "Tell me what you need to walk. We have a narrow window." Marsh took her hand and stood. "I can walk," she said. "I've been waiting to." There is something that happens in extreme circumstances that is difficult to describe to people who haven't experienced it. Not heroism. That word has been used so many times for so many different things that it's lost the specific weight it needs to mean anything precise. Not the adrenaline response. That's just biology. And it doesn't explain the quality of judgment that good people under pressure sometimes display. It's something closer to clarity. The noise falls away. Peripheral concerns. The small self-conscious calculations that occupy most of consciousness in ordinary life go quiet. What remains is the essential architecture of what matters and what needs doing. Riva had been living in that state at varying intensities for 3 years. Most people encounter it briefly in emergencies, in moments of crisis. They feel it for a few minutes and then the ordinary noise of life comes back. And afterward they sometimes describe the experience as feeling more alive than usual. Riva did not think of it as feeling alive. She thought of it as paying its attention. The same practice her father had modeled for her, in a different register over the course of her entire childhood. The discipline of being present to what was actually in front of you, of not letting what you wished were true interfere with what was true, of holding the full complexity of a situation without flinching away from the hard parts. He had taught her that in these same mountains, she was using it now, in these same mountains, to walk a 61-year-old woman through the dark towards safety while the man who had betrayed her was 200 meters to the north and didn't yet know his holding position was empty. He would know soon. And when he did, this would become a different kind of problem. But that was the next part. Behind her in the coordination station, Garrett Cole sat with his hands folded and his eyes on the radio panel. Teller had made 2 coffee cups and left one at Garrett's elbow without being asked. The small competency of that, the reading of the moment and the correct response to it, made Garrett feel, briefly, something generous toward the world. Young people who paid attention were not nothing. They were, in fact, the whole point. He picked up the coffee, drank it, thought about Riva at 8 years old on a ridge in the morning light, saying something more true than she could have known she was saying. It doesn't need you to be okay. It just keeps being what it is. He had thought at the time that she was talking about the mountains. Now he wondered if she had already understood something larger than that. Something about the nature of endurance. About what it meant to keep going, not because things were okay, they often weren't, but because you were, underneath everything, still standing. His daughter was still standing in a cold forest in the dark, wet and wounded and alone except for a woman she'd just pulled out of a holding cell. Still standing. Teller, Garrett said, "Sir, wake up the chain of command. All of it. FBI, D. Inspector General. Whoever Pressman has been calling all night, set down the coffee. Tell them we have an active situation. Tell them we have a surviving operator. And tell them," he paused, choosing the words, "tell them we need full documentation protocols in place before anyone goes into that forest, because whatever comes out of there tonight needs to be handled correctly." Teller was already on the panel. "Yes, sir." Garrett looked at the topographic map one more time, the rock formation, the river, the tree line. He knew those mountains, he knew his daughter. He would wait. Forest at 4 in the morning has a particular quality of dark. Not the dark of a room with the lights off, not the dark of a city street between lampposts. This is older than both of those. Denser, the kind of dark that has been accumulating in these mountains for thousands of years, settling into the spaces between trees the way cold settles into stone. Not as an absence of something, but as a presence of its own. Riva moved through it the way she moved through everything, deliberately, without wasted motion. One careful step at a time, Eleanor Marsh followed 3 feet behind her, matching her pace with the focused effort of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the last 4 hours, that she was not going to be the reason this went wrong. She was 61 years old, and her left knee had been problematic for 2 years, and the temperature was somewhere below 20 degrees. None of that was going to stop her. She had made up her mind about that in the holding structure, in the dark waiting. She had made up her mind, and then she had held on to it the way you hold on to something when the alternative is falling. They moved south, toward the river, toward the extraction point Riva had mapped 3 days ago during her reconnaissance of the area. Riva set the pace carefully, fast enough to matter, slow enough that Marsh could hold it. She did not speak. Marsh did not speak either. This was, Riva recognized, sign of good judgment. Silence in the field was not something that came naturally to most people. It required overriding the very human instinct to fill uncertain darkness with the sound of your own voice. Marsh was overriding it. That told Riva something useful about the woman behind her. Back at the coordination station, the phone lines were beginning to move. Garrett Cole had given Teller the instruction to start waking people up. Teller had done it with the systematic efficiency of someone who understood that the order mattered. Who you called first, what you told them, how you framed the information so that it traveled up the chain in the right shape. Garrett was not involved in those calls. He was sitting with the topographic map and the radio, and he was thinking. He was thinking about Owen Drexler. He was thinking about what it meant that Drexler was coordinating tonight's operation from a position inside the operational area, not from a rear command post. Not from a secure facility. He had come into the field himself, which was unusual for someone of his rank and his role. Senior instructors did not typically put themselves in the field for operations like this, unless they needed to be there personally. Unless there was something here that they didn't trust anyone else to handle. Garrett had spent 30 years in the Army. He had worked with and alongside men like Drexler, technically excellent, tactically brilliant, carrying the specific kind of authority that comes from being genuinely better at the work than almost everyone around you. He had also, over those 30 years, watched what happened to some of those men over time. The authority became its own problem. The excellence became a form of insulation. The accumulated distance between what they were capable of and what ordinary people could hold them accountable for. That distance became, for some of them, a kind of permission. Not all of them. Most of them were fine. Most of them were good men doing difficult work and carrying it honestly. But some of them, he thought about Riva saying, he doesn't waste words. He thought about what it cost her to have believed that. He picked up the radio handset and held it without transmitting. Just held it. The weight of it. The simple physical fact of a communication line that ran through this dark and cold and came out the other side to his daughter. 3 years. He was going to sit with the weight of that for a long time after tonight. Right now, he had work to do. 22 minutes into the southward movement, Riva stopped. She held up one fist, the universal signal. Marsh stopped immediately and went still. Riva crouched. She had heard something, not movement. Movement in snow at this distance produced a distinctive compression sound that she had long since catalogued and could identify at 30 meters in still air. This was different. This was the specific absence of a sound that should have been there. The night birds that had been calling from the northern tree line had gone quiet. Something had moved through their territory. She waited. Counted 10 slow breaths. Then she pointed left. 2 fingers, sharp angle. They adjusted their course 30 degrees east and moved at half the previous pace up for the next 4 minutes. Before she allowed the pace to return to normal, whatever had been to their north was now behind them. She did not explain any of this to Marsh. There would be time for explanation later. Right now the explanation was movement. The right movement, at the right speed, in the right direction. But let me tell you what she was thinking as she walked. Because Riva Cole was not simply executing a plan. She was continuously revising one. The 12 men she had dealt with in the past 3 hours had told her things by their positions, their equipment, their tactics. She had been reading those things as she went, building a picture of who had deployed them and how. Spread of the positions was too wide for a standard containment operation. They hadn't been positioned to catch someone coming in. They had been positioned to catch someone going out. That was different. The containment going out meant they had expected someone to be inside already. It meant the deployment had been designed around a specific understanding of who was in the operational area and what they were trying to do. Which meant someone had known she was here, not guessed, not estimated, known that thought required careful handling. She had learned long ago that the instinct to follow that kind of realization into paranoia was a trap. The useful version of it was simple. Someone had better intelligence on her movements than she had accounted for. She needed to know who. She needed to know how. She filed it and kept walking. The extraction point was 900 meters south. Back at the coordination stations, something was happening that Garrett was not yet aware of. Teller had made contact with the duty officer at the FBI's Field Coordination Center in Missoula. A man named Holbrook, experienced, direct, the kind of federal agent who had stopped being impressed by urgency a long time ago and responded to it instead with competence. Teller had given him the outline. Active operation, 6-man team down, surviving operator in the field. Asset secured. Holbrook had asked the right questions in the right order. When Teller got to the part about the ridgeline frequency and the designation and the 3-year gap in the active record, Holbrook had gone quiet in a specific way. The quiet of someone who has just heard a piece of information connect to something they were already holding. Who's the coordinating officer for tonight's operation? Holbrook asked. Teller gave him the name. Another silence. Longer, Drexler, Holbrook said. Not a question. Yes, sir. And he's physically in the field. According to the last position confirmation, yes. All right. Holbrook's voice had changed, still measured, but carrying something new underneath the measurement. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it carefully. I need you to not communicate anything further to Drexler's position, any updates, any situation reports, anything. Can you do that? Teller looked at Garrett across the room. Garrett had caught enough of the conversation to understand the shape of it. He gave Teller a small nod. Yes, sir, Teller said. I can do that. Good, Holbrook said. Don't log this call yet. I'll explain why later. He paused. And tell whoever is your senior man on site, the one who asked you to make these calls, that I need to speak with him. Teller held the handset out toward Garrett. Garrett took it. Holbrook, he said. Cole, a pause. Walter Sudbury called me 40 minutes ago. I know who you are, and I know why you're there. I also know more about the Ridgeline program closure than you do, and I've been waiting for something to break this open for 13 months. Another pause. Is she really out there? Garrett looked at the radio panel. The Ridgeline frequency. The green carrier light. Yes, he said. Holbrook breathed out. A long, controlled exhale. Then let's make sure what she brings out of there lands somewhere it can't be buried, he said. Riva found the guard's body by almost stepping on it. She had moved wide around the main camp position after leaving the holding structure, giving it 300 meters of clearance in a long arc to the east before turning south. Standard practice. You didn't retrace the route you'd come in on. You didn't walk a predictable line. She had not expected to find anyone this far out. He was positioned at the base of a granite outcropping, partially covered by a thermal blanket that had been designed to suppress his heat signature. Well trained then, or well equipped at minimum, he was lying on his side with his knees drawn up, a cold weather rest position, and the arrangement of him was so deliberately casual that it had almost read, at this distance in this light, as a man asleep. He was not asleep. Riva crouched beside him and checked quickly. Efficient, professional. Whatever had happened here, it had happened in the last 2 hours, which meant someone else had been in this forest tonight. Someone she had not known about. She searched him. Radio. Standard hardware. She checked the frequency match, the main camp channel. She pocketed it. A handgun. She checked the chamber and the magazine. Full, and in the inside pocket of his jacket, folded twice, a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it. Handwritten. Ink, not print. 12 lines of operational instruction in a compact, precise script she recognized without any difficulty at all. She had read hundreds of pages in that handwriting over 14 months of training. She could have identified it in worse light than this, at twice this distance. Owen Drexler's handwriting. She read the document. It was a deployment order. Clear and specific. It designated positions, timing, and priority targets for a containment operation. The language was technical, appropriately abbreviated, professionally constructed. The priority targets were listed by description, not name. The first. Extraction team, all personnel. No survivors. Necessary for operational security. The second. Asset. Elimination preferred. Capture only if documentation must be recovered first. The third target was described in 4 words. Ridgeline 7. Priority elimination. She read it twice. She folded the document and put it in her own pocket. She stood up. The cold settled around her. The snow continued its slow, indifferent falling. She had known in an abstract sense that this was the situation. She had understood the mechanics of it, that Drexler needed her gone, had needed her gone for 3 years, that tonight's convergence of factors had given him a context in which to accomplish that under operational cover. Knowing something abstractly and reading it in 12 handwritten lines were different experiences. Ridgeline 7. Priority elimination. He had written her out of existence on paper once before. Tonight he had intended to do it, in fact. She breathed in. Out, Tylet. Keep moving. She turned back to Marsh, who was watching her with the steady attention of a woman who had spent a career reading the information that other people's faces carried. What did you find? Marsh asked quietly. Riva held up the folded paper. Everything we needed, she said. They moved on. But the document had shifted something in Riva's calculation. Not her plan. The plan held. But her understanding of the timeline had changed. Drexler had written that order by hand, not electronically. Paper, ink, physical document. That was unusual in a way that required explanation. Paper orders didn't leave digital traces. Paper orders could be destroyed. Paper orders were what you used when you needed to give instructions that you didn't want to exist in any recoverable form after the fact, which meant Drexler was planning for aftermath. He was thinking about what the record would show when tonight was over. He was building, even now, a version of events that he intended to be able to survive. She thought all about that for 50 meters of walking. Then she understood. He wasn't just running a cleanup operation. He had already written the after-action report in his head. The story he would tell when this was done, an extraction operation that had gone wrong in complex terrain, resulting in multiple casualties, including, regrettably, an asset who had been caught in the crossfire. A tragedy. A documented tragedy, officially logged, officially mourned. The documents Marsh carried would not surface because Marsh would not surface. The Ridgeline 7 operator would not surface because she was already dead on paper, and dead people don't come back, and Drexler would return to whatever came next. She thought about this with the specific clarity of someone who has been building toward a single point for 3 years. Not tonight. They reached the river 40 minutes later. The crossing point Riva had identified in reconnaissance was 300 meters upstream from the position she'd used earlier. A broad, shallow section where the current spread wide and thin over a gravel bed, and the depth at the midpoint was less than a meter. Cold. Uncomfortable. Manageable. She looked at Marsh. How are you with cold water? Marsh considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I grew up in Minnesota, she said. I'll manage. They crossed. It took 4 minutes. Marsh went into the waist at the deepest point and made no sound that was audible beyond a meter. On the far bank, Riva helped her up, and they kept moving without stopping to recover. because stopping to recover in wet clothing at this temperature was a decision with a deteriorating timeline. The shelter was 200 meters east of the crossing point. Riva had prepared it 3 days ago, a natural overhang in a granite outcropping, augmented with a thermal tarp, and enough supplies for 48 hours if it came to that. She had not expected to need it. She had prepared it anyway. Preparation was not optimism or pessimism. It was just practice, inside the shelter with the tarp down and a small chemical heat source running. Smokeless, odorless, producing warmth in a 2-meter radius, Riva assessed Marsh properly for the first time. The bruises on her jaw was impact, not pressure. Someone had struck her. Her right wrist showed ligature marks from restraints. Her feet were in poor condition from cold and insufficient footwear. She was hypothermic in the early stages, coherent, functioning, the kind of tired that lived in the bones. Riva gave her the emergency thermal layer from the supply cache. Dry socks, 2 high-calorie bars and water. Then she sat down across from her. "Tell me about the documents," she said. Marsh looked at her directly. "How much do you know?" "I know Drexler's been receiving payments for 8 years. I have the routing structures for 4 of the payment channels and partial identification on 2 of the intermediaries. I know 2 operations were compromised using information that came from inside his program. I have the anomalous data that started this." Riva paused. "What I don't have is the top of the chain. Who Drexler answers to. Who's been running the money and why." Marsh reached inside her jacket. She produced a flash drive. She held it for a moment. "This took me 8 months," she said. "I had access to procurement records that most people in my position don't see because I spent 22 years building a reputation for being trustworthy with sensitive Nifansian channel data. I used that access carefully. I built the picture from the bottom up." She turned the drive in her fingers. "Drexler is not the top." Riva waited. "The network he's part of," Marsh continued, "was structured to keep the top layer insulated. The payments to Drexler came through a defense consulting group that exists legitimately on paper. But the money funding that consulting group comes from a different source. Political source." She paused. "There is a U.S. Senator currently chairing the Armed Services Subcommittee on Defense Procurement Oversight. His name is Aldrich Voss. He has been directing contract awards to specific companies in exchange for a financial arrangement that has been running for 11 years. Riva sat with that. "Voss is overseeing the committee that's supposed to be watching for exactly this kind of misconduct." She said, "Yes. And Drexler's network feeds information to the contractors who benefit from Voss's decisions."
Yes.
Drexler's information, mission timelines, program vulnerabilities, competitive intelligence from inside special operations, make certain contractors' proposals unusually accurate. Unusually competitive. It looks like expertise. It is in fact purchased inside knowledge, and Voss provides the political insulation. And has done for 11 years. Marsh held out the flash drive. "This has everything. The payment records, the routing, the contract comparisons, the timeline correlations. Forensic accountant could follow every dollar from Voss's arrangement back to its source and forward to its destination in approximately 72 hours. Riva took the drive. She held it. This small piece of hardware was what 12 people had died to prevent reaching the surface tonight. It was what 3 years of her life had been moving toward. It was the reason Owen Drexler had written her name on a priority elimination list. She put it in the interior pocket of her jacket. Buttoned the pocket closed. "There's a copy," Marsh said. Riva looked at her. "I'm not naive," Marsh said simply. "There's a copy in a location that will become accessible to specific people if I don't make contact in the next 18 hours. "Smart," Riva said. "I've been doing this a long time." Riva checked her receiver. The carrier signal from the coordination station was still active. Steady. Patient. She thought about her father sitting in that room. She thought about what she knew of him. The patience that was not passivity. The steadiness that was not absence of feeling. Particular form of love that expressed itself primarily as showing up and staying put. He had been showing up and staying put her entire life. He had been doing it tonight in that ranger post for hours. She picked up the transmitter. She sent a pulse pattern. Longer this time. Moving to secondary. Documentation secure. 2 persons. "Wait for my signal." The response came back in 40 seconds. "Ride you clear. FBI on site. Chain of command engaged. Take your time." She read it twice. FBI on site. He had moved fast. She felt something she didn't have an immediate name for. Not relief. She had not allowed herself to feel the absence of relief, which meant the arrival of it was not straightforward. Something adjacent to it. A particular sensation of a weight that you have been carrying so long you forgot it was separate from you, shifting very slightly. Not gone. Not yet. But shifting. Marsh was watching her. Your father, Marsh said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He reached out to the right people. He always does, Reva said. She paused. He knows these mountains better than anyone. He's been coming here his whole life. She looked at the wall of the shelter, the cold stone behind the thermal tarp. I showed him this overhang when I was 19. I told him it was the best natural shelter position is this drainage. Marsh smiled faintly. And he remembered. He remembers everything, Reva said. It's one of his most useful qualities. She said it in a tone that was not quite flat and not quite warm. Something in between. The specific register of a person describing someone they love in a way that keeps the love from getting too loud, because the moment isn't finished yet and they need to stay in it. Marsh understood that register. She said nothing more. Owen Drexler had been awake for 19 hours. He was accustomed to this. In his 30s and 40s, he had run operations on 48-hour cycles with no meaningful sleep and maintained the quality of his judgment throughout. He was 54 now and the recovery took longer, but the capacity was still there. He had taken care of himself in the ways that mattered, physically disciplined, mentally structured, no significant chemical dependencies of any kind. He sat in his portable command post at the northern position and waited for the confirmation reports that were now 40 minutes overdue. He was not yet alarmed. Operations developed. Timelines slipped. He had built margins into the plan. 40 minutes was becoming a number, he noticed. The radio from the southern perimeter had gone quiet at 0322. He had attributed it initially to frequency interference from the terrain. The granite ridgeline to the east produced unpredictable reflections. He had waited for his southern team to re-establish contact on the secondary channel. They had not. He picked up that headset for the secondary channel. Static. Clean static, not interference static. The specific clean sound of a channel with no transmitter active on it anywhere in range. He set it down. He looked at the thermal imaging tablet on the table in front of him. The resolution at this range in these conditions was limited. Too much weather. Too much terrain interference for reliable small signature detection. But the larger heat sources he'd been monitoring throughout the night, the fire positions, the holding structure, were showing correctly. Except the holding structure was reading cold. He leaned forward. The holding structure's thermal signature had dropped over the last 40 minutes to ambient temperature. A structure occupied by a living person, even in these conditions, would hold several degrees of differential heat for at least 2 hours after the person left. The structure had gone cold. He stood up. He had built this operation with considerable care. He had thought through the variables and weighted them, and constructed contingencies for the ones that mattered. He had accounted for the extraction team. He had accounted for the asset and her documents. He had accounted for Ridgeline 7. He had read the assessment on Reva Cole carefully when he wrote her file closed 3 years ago. He had written it himself, the evaluation of her capabilities, the projection of what she might be capable of operating outside the sanctioned framework. He had filed that evaluation in a part of his thinking that he did not examine often, because examining it required acknowledging things about his own judgment that were uncomfortable. He had trained her specifically. He had identified her capabilities and developed them deliberately. He had, over 14 months, made her into something that was considerably more difficult to stop than the average adversary. And then he had signed the order that was supposed to end her. He had told himself at the time that he was being practical. She had found something she shouldn't have found. The exposure was intolerable. The decision was a professional calculation made under professional necessity. He had believed that. He was less certain about it now, standing in a cold command post at 4 in the morning, looking at a thermal display that told him everything he'd deployed tonight had stopped reporting in. He put on his jacket. He picked up his sidearm and checked it with the automatic thoroughness of long practice. He stepped outside. The snow was falling. The forest was quiet. The mountains were doing what they always did, existing without any particular concern for what happened inside them. He looked south, if she was still alive, and the evidence suggested she was, though he had not yet fully committed to that conclusion. She would be moving south, toward the river, toward distance and options, and he knew how she moved. He had spent 14 months studying it, correcting it, refining it. He thought about that for a moment, knowing how she moved, knowing how she thought, knowing better than almost anyone alive what she was capable of. He had 2 men left, both at his position. He had kept Tomna back from the deployment because he had wanted a reserve, and now the reserve was all he had. He made a decision. With me, he said to them. South, they moved through the forest in a line. Drexler in the middle, a man named Carver on his left, a man named Tesh on his right. Both of them were experienced. Both of them were equipped. Both of them understood, from the silence of every radio channel, that the night had gone badly wrong in ways that were not yet fully explained. Neither of them asked questions. Drexler moved with the economy of someone who had spent 3 decades in operational environments. Despite his age, despite the hours, his movement was clean, controlled. He placed his feet carefully in the snow, reading the terrain, adjusting his line continuously. He had taught Riva to move like this. She had learned it faster than anyone he had ever trained. He thought about her at 19, the age she had been when she walked into the selection program. She had been the quietest person in the cohort by a significant margin, not shy. Quiet in the specific way of someone who had decided early that observation was more valuable than commentary. She had watched everything, asked almost nothing, and then, in the moments that required action, had been more decisive than people twice her age and experience. He had seen very early that she was exceptional. He had built on it. Deliberately and with considerable investment of his own time and knowledge. The techniques he had passed to her, the patience especially, the ability to hold still for extended periods while maintaining full mental engagement, were things he had developed over 30 years. He had given them to her in 14 months. He had done it because excellence deserved to be cultivated. He had done it because it was the work, and the work was what he had. And then she had found the thing she'd found, and everything had come apart in the specific way that things come apart when they are built on something that cannot hold weight. He did not allow himself to examine this too closely while moving through a dark forest. There would be time for that later, or there wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't useful now. What was useful now was finding her. He stopped. He held up a fist. Carver and Tesh stopped. He listened. The forest was quiet in the way it had been quiet all night. But underneath the quiet, something, a faint chemical signature almost below the threshold of detection. Not wood smoke, not natural, something synthetic, heat source, chemical. Smokeless. He turned his head slowly, oriented on the signature east. Approximately 200 meters, he looked at Carver. Pointed, they adjusted their line. Back at the coordination station at 4:47 a.m., everything moved at once. 3 vehicles arrived on the access road in a rolling stop. 2 FBI tactical units and a DoD Inspector General representative named Hargrove, who had driven from Missoula in 2 hours flat, which was not physically possible without exceeding the speed limit by a significant margin for the entire distance. Teller met them at the door. Garrett Cole stood behind him. Holbrook, the FBI duty officer from Missoula, had come himself. He was 50, gray at the temples, wearing an expression that was all business. He looked at Garrett and gave him a single nod that communicated about 6 different things simultaneously. "What do we have?" he said. Garrett walked him to the radio panel. The topographic map. "Carrier signal. She's in a secondary shelter position," Garrett said. "Eastern Bank, approximately 2 kilometers south of the main contact point. She has the asset. She has documentation." He paused. "She also has a deployment order signed by Drexler. Physical copy." His handwriting, Holbrook looked at him. "She recovered a signed paper order in the field?" From a perimeter position, Holbrook processed this. "That's enough for immediate action. It's enough for significantly more than that," Garrett said. "But there's a complication. Drexler. Drexler is still in the field. With whatever personnel he has remaining," Garrett looked at the thermal display, "he's going to figure out his operation has collapsed. When he does, he'll move, and there's only one direction that makes sense for him to move." Holbrook was already looking at the map. "Toward her," he said. "Toward the documents," Garrett said. "She's carrying them." He knows that's what this comes down to. Holbrook turned to the tactical unit leader, a woman named Breck, who had the composed authority of someone who had done this many times before. "I need a fast route into that eastern drainage," Holbrook said. "Helicopter, if the weather allows, ground if not." Breck was already on her radio. Garrett looked at the map, at the rock formation on the eastern bank, at the river, at the long corridor of trees between the coordination station and wherever his daughter was right now. He thought about a 19-year-old in ROTC who had come home one weekend and spread a topo map on his kitchen table and said, "Show me how you read terrain." Not the technical part, the instinct part. "How do you know where to look?" Sat down across from her at that table. He had pointed to the map. "You look for where the land would go if it were water," he had said. "Water always finds the easiest path. Terrain that has been shaped by water will show you the routes that work. Everything else is decoration. She had looked at the map for a long time. Then she had looked up at him. That's the most useful thing anyone has ever told me about navigation, she had said. He had laughed. He had not known then she would carry that lesson into places he could never have imagined for her. He knew it now. In the shelter, Riva was replacing the dressing on her shoulder. She had her field kit open on the ground in front of her. Clean gauze, antiseptic, fresh compression wrap. She worked with her right hand and her teeth where necessary, efficient and impersonal about it. The way you became efficient and impersonal about your own pain after enough time. Marsh watched her. How long have you been doing this? Field medicine. Since I was 20, not field medicine. This, Marsh gestured at the space around them, living outside the system. Operating without support. Riva pulled the compression wrap tight and secured it. 3 years, she said. That's a long time to be alone. Riva looked at her. Yes, she said. There was a quality to that single word that was different from the way she'd said other words tonight. Slightly less armored, not vulnerable. Vulnerability in this environment was a resource allocation problem, and she had long since made her calculations on it. But honest, you chose it, Marsh said. It was not a judgment. I chose to protect the people who would have been at risk if I'd stayed visible, Riva said. That's different from choosing the isolation, is it? Riva was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, but not by as much as I'd like. Marsh was quiet too. Heat source hummed. Outside the tarp, the snow made no sound at all. My husband died 4 years ago, Marsh said. Heart attack. We had been married 36 years. She looked at her hands. I went back to work 6 weeks later because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I took this project, the financial records, all of it, partly because I believed in it and partly because I needed something that was entirely consuming, something that would take up all the space. Riva looked at her. It works, Marsh said, for a while, and then one day you realize that the work has become the thing you're hiding inside, and the grief is still there, exactly where you left it, perfectly preserved. Shelter was quiet. I'm not saying that's you, Marsh said. I'm saying it's a pattern I recognize. Riva secured the last piece of the wrap. She looked down at her hands for a moment. My father didn't have the option of going back to work, she said. He didn't have the option of being too busy. She paused. He just had to sit with it. Yes, Marsh said. The people we leave behind. They don't get the option of the consuming project. Riva said nothing. But something in her face changed slightly. The shelter was very quiet. The receiver pulsed short, urgent. A pattern she recognized as a warning flag. She was up before the second pulse finished. Movement, your direction. 3 signatures. Armed Garrett. At the coordination station. With FBI tactical support and a thermal overview she didn't have. Her father was watching the mountain. She looked at Marsh. We need to move, she said. Now Marsh was already on her feet. Drexler moved through the trees like a man who had done this 10,000 times. Because he had 31 years of operational environments, had built something into his body that existed below the level of thought. A way of reading terrain as he moved through it, processing information continuously, adjusting without pausing to adjust. His feet found the quiet places in the snow automatically. His eyes tracked the dark in layers. Near, middle, far. Near, middle, far. A rhythm as natural as breathing. Carver was 6 meters to his left. Tesh to his right. Good men. Professionals. They moved cleanly and they didn't speak, and they understood, from the silence of everything else tonight, that the situation had shifted into something that required a different quality of attention. Drexler had not briefed them fully. He rarely briefed anyone fully. If information was a resource like any other, you allocated it where it would do the most good and you retained what you needed to retain. What they knew, there was a survivor. Armed. Moving south with the asset what Drexler knew. The survivor was Riva Cole, who was, on paper, dead. Who had been, in fact, operating for 3 years outside any sanctioned framework. Who had been, unless his read of the night's events was entirely wrong, working toward exactly this convergence for a very long time. He thought about that as he moved. She had known at some point that tonight would happen. Not the specifics. You could not plan specifics at this remove. But the shape of it. She had known that Marsh and the documents and the pressure they represented would eventually force his hand. She had known that when he moved, he would move comprehensively. She had positioned herself to be here when it happened. That was not reactive. That was constructed. He had taught her to think that way. The recognition of that, the particular irony of it, was not something he allowed to slow his movement. He filed it and kept going, but he felt it. The chemical heat signature had been stronger 100 meters back. He had adjusted his line twice, following it, and now the signal was lateral rather than ahead. She had moved. He stopped, held up a fist. Carver and Tesh went still. He stood in the silence of the forest and thought about where she would go. He knew she had the asset with her. 61-year-old woman in inadequate clothing with a bad knee. That was a constraint. It set a ceiling on movement speed and a floor on how far she could get in the time available. He knew the terrain. He had studied the topographic maps before coming in. The extraction point for the original team had been disabled. He had seen to that during the planning phase. The secondary extraction routes depended on reaching either the North Access Road or the Eastern Logging Corridor. Both of those were now effectively closed. She left the river south, across the river, into the eastern drainage. He looked at Tesh. River crossing, he said quietly. She's heading for the eastern bank. Tesh nodded. They turned south. At the coordination station, the FBI tactical unit was loading into a vehicle that could handle the mountain roads in current conditions. Breck had assessed the weather and ruled out helicopter approach. The ceiling was too low, the visibility too limited. Ground approach only. Estimated time to the eastern drainage, 22 minutes, possibly 18 if the road held. Garrett Cole was standing at the door. Holbrook looked at him. "You're staying here," Holbrook said. "No," Garrett said. A pause. "Cole, he's going to need a familiar frequency when this is over," Garrett said. "She's going to need to know someone she trusts is on the other end." He picked up the portable radio unit from the panel. "I can monitor from the vehicle. I'm not going into the field, but I'm not staying here." Holbrook looked at him for a moment, then he stepped aside. Garrett walked out the door. The snow hit his face. Cold, steady, indifferent. He barely noticed. He climbed into the second vehicle. The convoy moved out. Friva had moved Marsh 200 meters east before she stopped, not because east was the right direction, because it was the unexpected direction. If Drexler was moving south, which he would be, because south was the logical line and Drexler was a logical man, then east bought her time and repositioned the dynamic. He would expect south. He would move fast on south. She would let him be fast in the wrong direction for as long as it took her to do what she needed to do. She settled Marsh against a large rock formation with clear sight lines back to the west. "You have the backup handgun from the cache," she said. "Yes. If anything comes from that direction that isn't me, use it." She paused. "Don't wait to be sure. At this range and in this light, hesitation is the only mistake that matters." Marsh looked at the handgun, then at Riva. "Go," she said. Riva went. She moved north, back toward Drexler. This was the reversal of every instinct that untrained people had in dangerous situations. When something is coming toward you, you move away. That was the biological program. It was also, in the right circumstances, exactly wrong. Drexler was expecting her to run. He had always been better than her at pursuit. She had known that about herself since the third week of training. He was faster on open ground, and he could sustain a higher pace over longer distances. She had never been able to close that gap entirely. It was a physical reality she had filed and worked around for years. She did not need to outrun him. She needed to reframe the situation so that running was no longer the operative activity. She moved north at a pace that was faster than it looked, covering ground efficiently, her footprints in the snow deliberate now, rather than minimized. Let him find the trail. Let him follow it. She was taking him somewhere specific. The place she had in mind was a natural channel between two granite ridgelines, approximately 300 meters north of the shelter. She had identified it on her reconnaissance 3 days ago and filed it without a specific plan attached. Just, "This is useful terrain. Keep it." The channel was 12 meters wide and 200 meters long. The walls on both sides were vertical granite, no egress left or right. The floor was clear snow, relatively firm, easy to move on. It looked from the south entrance like a direct route through. It was not 40 meters into the channel the floor dropped. Not dramatically. A 2-meter step down onto a lower shelf, concealed by the angle of approach and the snow that had accumulated on the edge. If anyone moving at pace through the channel, confident in the surface, would step onto what appeared to be solid ground and find air. Not lethal, but disruptive. Disruptive was enough. She reached the channel entrance, put her footprints clearly into the approach, and then stopped. She stepped sideways off the trail, carefully, onto a rock surface that wouldn't hold clear prints, and climbed 6 feet up the eastern wall. Found a ledge, pressed herself flat, and waited 3 minutes and 40 seconds. That was how long it took. She heard them before she saw them. The compression of snow under 3 sets of feet, moving at a pace that was quick but controlled. Confident. They had found her trail and they were following it. She watched from the ledge. Drexler entered the channel first. He moved well. She had forgotten in 3 years of building her picture of him as an adversary, the specific quality of how he moved. There was no wasted motion in it, each step placed with precision. His head turning in the methodical scan she recognized because she had learned it from watching him. Carver was 3 steps behind on the left, Tesh on the right. She watched them enter the channel. She watched them move toward the drop. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel triumph. What she felt was the specific, focused calm of someone executing a plan that has been carried for a long time and is now finally arriving at its completion. Tesh hit the drop first. He went down hard, the 2-meter step unexpected, snow-covered edge, and the sound he made was a sharp, involuntary exhale, and then the heavier sound of a person and equipment hitting a lower surface. Carver pulled up, looked left. Disoriented, Drexler stopped 1 second. In that second, he understood what had happened. She saw it in the set of his shoulders, the particular shift of a man who has just realized he has been led somewhere. He turned, not fast enough. She dropped from the ledge. She landed 4 feet from him, knees bent, absorbing the impact cleanly, and came up with the sidearm level. "Don't," she said, 1 word. He went completely still. Carver was moving, coming around to her left. She tracked him without breaking eye contact with Drexler. "Tell him to put it down," she said. Drexler looked at her. This was the moment she had thought about in various forms for 3 years. The moment of facing him directly. She had imagined it many times, had worked through the emotional architecture of it deliberately, the way you work through difficult terrain in your mind before you have to walk it. Had tried to anticipate what she would feel. She had not anticipated this. What she felt looking at him was something close to grief, not for herself, for the version of this that could have been different. For the 14 months of genuine instruction that had been real. She believed that, even now, even knowing what she knew. He had given her real knowledge. He had invested real attention. The quality of what he had built in her was not a performance or a manipulation. It was the work of someone who genuinely cared about the craft, and he had still signed her name on a list and called her dead. Both things were true. She held that. "Kharkiver," Drexler said quietly. "Put it down." A pause, then the sound of a weapon being placed on snow. "Kick it away," Riva said, the sound of it sliding across the frozen surface. Drexler looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in training when she had done something correctly. Not pleased exactly, but registering. Taking the information in. "You came back north," he said. "Yes. I expected south, I know." A silence. "You've been planning this for a long time," he said. 3 years. He absorbed that. "The documents," he said. "Marsh, she's secure. The documents are with her. They won't use them." His voice was level, not desperate. She would have recognized desperation in him, and this wasn't it. It was the measured tone of a man making an argument he still half believed. "Voss has too much insulation. The system protects itself." "You know that. I used to think so," she said. "What changed?" "I stopped waiting for the system to protect itself and started building a record that didn't need it to." He was quiet. "How long have you been recording?" he asked. She reached into her jacket pocket and held up the device. "Small. Unremarkable. Since you entered the forest tonight," she said. He looked at it. She watched him do the calculation. Everything he had said, every instruction he had given, everything that had been transmitted on the radios she had collected from his personnel. She watched him arrive at the conclusion. His face did something she had not expected. It settled, not acceptance exactly. Something beneath acceptance. Specific quality of a man who has been carrying a weight that was too heavy for too long and has just reached the point where putting it down, even in the worst possible way, is a form of relief. "You used to trust me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I did." 2 words carried everything she had chosen not to say. He heard them. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "It doesn't change what happens next." He secured Drexler's hands with the restraint cord from her kit. Professional. Clean. The same technique he had taught her in the 2nd month of training. She thought about not noting that. She noted it anyway. Internally, quietly, the way you note the specific texture of an irony that is too precise to be comfortable. Carver she secured to a tree with his own equipment. Tesh, in the lower channel, was conscious and mobile but disoriented from the fall. She climbed down, blessed him. No serious wrist, a bruised ego of significant proportions, and secured him as well. Then she moved Drexler back toward the shelter. He walked without resistance. This was something she had not entirely planned for, his cooperation. She had prepared for several versions of this encounter. including versions that were considerably more difficult than this one. His quiet compliance reordered things slightly. She let herself think about why. He was 54 years old. He had been doing this for 31 years. He had, at some point in those years, made a decision that had led him here, to a frozen channel in Montana in the early morning, restrained by a woman he had trained, with a recording device holding everything he had said tonight. Maybe, she thought, this was not a surprise to him. Maybe some part of him misunderstood from the moment she had walked out of that selection program 7 years ago that it would eventually come to something like this. You didn't train someone that well and expect them to stop using it because you told them to. You didn't sign their name as dead and expect them to stay that way. He had built her too well to make either of those bets safely. Marsh was where Riva had left her. She looked at Drexler when they arrived. A long, steady look. The gaze of a woman who had spent 8 months building a forensic case around this man's actions and who was now looking at him in person for the first time. She didn't speak to him. She turned to Riva. FBI? Inbound, Riva said. 18 minutes, maybe less, Marsh nodded. She sat down on the rock she had been using as a seat. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than the physical. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding something important together for a very long time and can feel the structure beginning to relax now that other hands are reaching for it. Riva understood that. She'd been holding something together for 3 years. She could feel it too, the slight loosening. The sense of a load beginning to transfer. She didn't put it down yet. Not completely, not until it was fully handed over. But she could feel the possibility of it. Drexler sat against the rock face on the opposite side of the shelter. He did not speak. He looked at the ground in front of him with the focused interior attention of someone working through a complicated calculation. For 10 minutes he looked up. The money, he said. The arrangement with Voss. He paused. It started because of a program funding cut. 2016. They pulled the budget on a training initiative it was the best work I ever did. The most important work. They cut it for budget reasons. I found a way to keep it funded. Riva looked at him. People I trained from that program, he continued. They're out there right now. Operating. Alive because of what they learned in it. He paused. I'm not asking you to weight that differently. I'm telling you what the inside of it looked like. She was quiet for a moment. I know what the inside of it looked like, she said. I've had 3 years to think about it. He looked at her. And you made a decision that had a logic to it, she said. At the beginning. And then the logic became the thing you were protecting. And the decision became the thing you were protecting. And eventually you were so far inside the structure of it that you couldn't see the outside anymore. She paused. That's how it always works. He was quiet. You're right, he said. I know I'm right. That doesn't make it easier. It's not supposed to be easy. She said, easy is not the point. Sky had begun its slow change from black to the deep gray blue that preceded dawn in mountain country. Not light yet, not warmth. Just the first intimation that the dark was finite. Riva sat at the entrance of the shelter and watched it. She was thinking about the recording device in her pocket, and the flash drive in the pocket next to it, and the paper deployment order in the pocket next to that 3 pieces of evidence. Each one sufficient on its own to do significant damage to the structure Drexler and Voss had built over 11 years. Together they were something else. Something comprehensive enough that the usual mechanisms of burial and delay and bureaucratic insulation would have difficulty finding purchase. She had built this carefully, not just the last 3 years. The whole thing. The documentation protocol, the dead drop channel that had reached Marsh, the parallel record she had assembled from sources that couldn't be connected to a ghost, the timing of it all. She had understood from early on that the documents alone were not enough. Documents could be contested. Documents could be lost. Documents needed a chain of custody and a credible source and a delivery mechanism that was harder to interrupt than a single person walking into an office. She had built all of that. The FBI being inbound was not an accident. Garrett hadn't stumbled onto the right call. He had called the right person, Walt Sudbury, who had been, she had known for over a year, someone who had been tracking the Voss arrangement from a different angle and waiting for a way in. She had not been able to reach Sudbury directly without surfacing. But she had known her father's network. She had known that if Garrett Cole started pulling the right threads, he would get there. She had built a pathway for her father without telling him it existed. She had trusted him to find it. He had. The radio in her hand pulsed. She recognized the pattern immediately. Her father's voice followed. Not transmitted words, but the code. Short and long. private language of a camping trip and a kitchen table and a daughter who had been building something her whole life earlier than anyone knew. We are 4 minutes out. East Access Road. Holbrook with us. You are safe to surface. She read it twice. She looked at the sky. 4 minutes. She had been underground, in one form or another, for 3 years. She had been cold and alone, and carrying things that were too heavy to put down, and she had done it because she understood why it was necessary, and understanding why something is necessary does not make it light. She reached for the transmitter. She held it for a moment. In the shelter behind her, Marsh was quiet. Drexler was quiet. The mountains were doing what they always did, absorbing the dark and the cold and the snow and the weight of everything happening inside them without comment. She pressed the key, not the code this time. Words, her own voice, low and clear in the pre-dawn silence. Dad, the single word, the Vietnamese word for father that she had used as a child and had stopped using somewhere in her 20s when she had become a professional, and the professional language had crowded out the other kind. She said it now without thinking about it. I'm here. Eastern Bank, 100 meters south of the second crossing point. A silence on the line, then his voice. Real voice, not code. Low and unsteady in a way she had heard from him exactly twice before. Once when her mother died, once when he thought he was saying goodbye to her before her first deployment. I see your light, he said. She looked down. Small infrared marker she had activated on the shelter entrance. Standard procedure. She had done it automatically, as part of surfacing protocol, without thinking about the fact that it meant he could see her from the road. He could see her from the road. Don't come off the road, she said. The approach terrain is. I know the terrain, he said. A pause. Yeah, she said. You do. Vehicles reached the eastern access point at 5:14 a.m., 4 of them. 2 FBI tactical units, the DoD Inspector General's vehicle, and the one Garrett Cole had climbed into without asking permission. Holbrook was out first. He moved with the controlled urgency of someone who understood the difference between fast and reckless, and was choosing fast. Breck and the tactical unit spread wide in a perimeter pattern. Professional and quiet, covering the approach, Garrett got out of the vehicle. Stood on the road. The eastern drainage stretched out below him. Trees and snow, and the river somewhere out in the gray-blue dark. And at the edge of his infrared monocular, a small red light blinking with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time. He started down the slope, Holbrook's voice behind him. Cole, he kept walking. She met him at the tree line. He saw her before she saw him. She was looking south, tracking Breck's team, doing the automatic work of monitoring an approach even now. Even here, even at the end of 3 years of everything. Then she turned. For a moment neither of them moved. She looked like her mother in the specific way she always had, the shape of her face, the set of her eyes, the quality of attention she gave to everything she looked at. She also looked like no one but herself. A person shaped by things he had given her and things she had built on her own, and 3 years of experience that he did not yet know and might not ever fully know. She was wearing wet clothing that had partially dried and refrozen. Her left shoulder carried a compression wrap. He could see through the tear in her jacket. There was a cut above her right eye that had been cleaned and closed with tape. She was standing straight. He reached her. He put his hand on the side of her face, the gesture he had made when she was 5 years old and frightened by a thunderstorm. The same gesture, no different in its bones, and she leaned into it for 1 second before she straightened again. Bo, she said. Yeah, he said. His voice not steady. He had stopped pretending 3 years ago that being a person who kept his voice steady in difficult moments was more important than being honest about what the moments cost. Yeah, I know. Stood in the tree line while the sky continued its slow change, and the FBI team secured the shelter position, and the mountains did their ancient work of holding everything inside them without judgment. After a long moment, she said, I couldn't tell you. I know you couldn't. I thought about it every day. I know that too. She looked at him. How? She asked. He thought about that for a moment. Because I know you, he said. The same way I know this terrain. Not because someone explained it to me. Because I've been paying attention for 26 years. She was quiet. He lowered his hand. Let's get you out of this cold, he said. Holbrook took the flash drive, the deployment order, and the recording device in an evidence chain that was documented with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting 13 months for exactly this material and was not going to give it any opportunity to be challenged on procedural grounds. Spoke to Marsh for 40 minutes. Riva listened from nearby, not participating unless asked. Drexler was transported in the second vehicle. He did not resist. He did not speak except once. When he was being helped into the vehicle, stopped and looked back at Riva across the frozen ground. "You're better than I was," he said. She looked at him. "At the work," she said. "Maybe." "Not at the other things." He absorbed that. "No," he said. "Not at the other things." They put him in the vehicle and closed the door. Hargrove, the DoD Inspector General representative, was a compact, careful man who communicated primarily through the quality of his listening. He had said almost nothing during the initial briefing. He had taken notes. He had asked 3 questions, each precisely targeted, each receiving an answer that produced another round of careful note-taking. When he was done, he came to stand beside Riva. He looked at the shelter position, the secured personnel, the documentation chain that Holbrook was building with methodical care. "The Voss connection," he said. "How solid is it?" "The financial routing is documented end-to-end," Riva said. "The contract comparisons are documented. The timeline correlation between Drexler's information transfers and Voss's committee decisions is documented." She paused, and Drexler confirmed it on the recording tonight. Unprompted, he was making a different argument, but the confirmation is there. "This will take time," he said. "Voss has resources. He will deploy them." "I know," Riva said. "That's why I built 3 years of documentation instead of 6 months." He looked at her. "Who trained you to think like this?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "My father," she said. "And the man you just put in that vehicle." Hargrove processed that. "I'll need you available for the next 6 months," he said. "Testimony, documentation review, chain of custody verification. It will be considerable." "I know, and your status will need to be formally reinstated before you can participate in official proceedings. The killed in action designation." "I understand the process," she said. "I've had 3 years to think about it." He nodded once. "We'll start that paperwork today," he said. He walked back toward the vehicles. Garrett was standing near the road with a cup of coffee that someone on Holbrook's team had produced from a thermos. He held a second cup out when she came up the slope. She took it, stood together in the pre-dawn gray. The cold was the same cold it had been all night, deep and honest, and not interested in anyone's feelings about it. The snow had stopped falling sometime in the last hour. The world was very still. Hargrove said 6 months of availability. She said, "Where will you stay?" He looked back. "The spare room is the same," he said. "I didn't change anything." She was quiet for a moment. "That's either very touching or extremely concerning," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same family. "Probably both," he said. She drank the coffee. It was mediocre. Thermos coffee at 5 in the morning in the Montana cold, made by someone whose primary skill set was tactical operations rather than beverage preparation. It was also the best thing she had tasted in a long time. She stood next to her father and drank it. There is something that the mountains do with the things that happen inside them. They don't erase them. That is a romantic idea, and it isn't true. If you go back to a place where something happened, the geography remembers it. Not in any mystical sense, but in the physical record. The tree that fell, the rock that shifted, the place where the water changed its course, the record stays. But the mountains are also very large and very old, and the things that happen inside them are proportionally small, and the passage of time does its patient work without commentary. By morning, the snow that had fallen all night would have softened the tracks. By afternoon, more snow would cover them. By spring, the river would change its surface entirely. The ice would go, the water would rise, the banks would look different than they look now. The events of the night would not be erased, but they would become part of a landscape that was larger than them, that had been here before them, that would be here after. Riva stood in the cold and understood this the way she had understood it since she was 8 years old on a ridge with her father. The mountains did not need you to be okay. They were not interested in your outcome. They just kept being what they were, and inside that, inside the vast indifference of things that had been true for millions of years, there was paradoxically something that felt like rest, not resolution, not completion in the sense of finished, just the permission to put the weight down for a moment, to let someone else hold the next piece, to stand still in the cold with a bad cup of coffee and feel the ground under your feet. Holbrook came to her before the convoy was ready to move. "One thing I need to ask you now," he said, "before we go in and everything becomes official." She waited. 12 people, he said, careful, not accusatory, the voice of someone who needed to understand, not someone who needed to assign blame. "In the field tonight, yes, I'll need your account of that." "You'll have it," she said. "For the record, were you in reasonable fear for your life and the life of the asset?" She looked at him. They had a signed deployment order designating both of us as priority elimination, she said. You have the physical document? Yes. Then yes, she said. For the record, he nodded. All right, he said. We'll do the formal account tomorrow. After you've slept, he started to walk away, she said. Holbrook, he turned. The extraction team, she said. The 6 men who went dark, face shifted slightly. The controlled professional expression carrying something heavier underneath. We'll have a full account of that by midday, he said. I'm sorry. She absorbed that 6 men. She had known it was probable. She had known it from the moment every tracker went offline. Knowing it as probable and knowing it as confirmed were different in a way she would not process tonight. She filed it. Carefully. They shouldn't have been in there without better intelligence on the situation, she said. No, Holbrook said. They shouldn't have. That's on Drexler's operational planning. Make sure that's in the record. It will be. She nodded. He walked away. She stood with it for a moment. 6 men she had never met, who had gone into a forest because they were told to and had not come out, who had families, who had people who would get the call today or tomorrow, who had nothing to do with the architecture of what Drexler and Voss had built, except that they had been in the way of it. She put that in the place where she kept the things that needed to be carried for a long time. She turned back to her father. Convoy was loading. Marsh was in the first vehicle, warm, wrapped, already deep in conversation with Holbrook's team. She was in her element now. The documents were in evidence chains. The work was beginning. Riva looked at the shelter one last time. The thermal tarp. The cache she had prepared 3 days ago. The rock she had set it on while Marsh slept for 40 minutes in the early hours. She had built this position in the middle of a forest she had known since childhood because she understood that the places you know are the places you can use. Her father had taught her that terrain knowledge was not academic. It was survival. He had been right about that. He had been right about most things. She turned away from the shelter. She walked up the slope to the road. Her father was waiting by the vehicle. He handed her the coffee cup she had set down, and she shook her head and he drank the last of it himself without comment. They got in the vehicle. The convoy started moving. They drove in silence for a while. The road wound down from the eastern drainage through the forest. The trees close on both sides, snow-heavy, the sky lightening above them in that steady mountain way that had no drama to it, just the patient accumulation of dawn. After a few minutes, her father said, Your shoulder, it's fine, you need stitches. Probably 3, she said. I can do them myself. You are not doing them yourself. She looked at him. He looked back. There's a very good doctor in Missoula, he said. I've been going to her for 12 years. She doesn't ask more questions than she needs to. Okay, she said. He nodded. They drove. After another few minutes, she said, The spare room? You said you didn't change anything. No, my books are still there? Everything. She was quiet. There's a box in the closet, she said. Second shelf. Brown cardboard, no label. I need you to not open it until I tell you what it is. He glanced at her. All right. It's not anything bad, she said. It's documentation. The parallel record I built over 3 years. Hard copies organized. She paused. I mailed it to you in 4 separate packages over the last 2 years. From different locations, he was quiet. She could see him working through the implication of that, the care of it, the planning, the decision to use his address as the storage point for her most critical material, the trust that required, the risk it placed on him without his knowledge. She waited for the question she expected. He didn't ask it. Instead, he said, The skin shelf. Got it. She looked at him. You're not going to ask why you? I know why me, he said. Same reason I know this terrain. 26 years of paying attention. The road curved south. The mountains fell away on either side, and the valley opened up, and the sky above them was the color of iron warming toward dawn, not gold yet, not fully light, but the specific gray that meant the dark was finished. She had been in that dark for 3 years. She sat in the moving vehicle and felt the road underneath her, and the heat from the vents and her father's presence on her left. Familiar as anything she had ever known, unchanged in all the ways that mattered, same patient attention directed at her that had been directed at her since before she had words for it. She exhaled, a long, slow, complete exhale, the kind you could only do when the work was done, when what you had been carrying was finally in other hands, when the ground beneath you was, at least for this moment, at least for this morning, solid. There is a thing that people who have been through significant difficulty sometimes discover on the other side of it, not that it was worth it. That calculation is too simple for what hard things actually cost. Not that everything happens for a reason. That is a comfort that requires believing in a kind of order that the evidence does not always support, something smaller, and in its smallness, more durable. That you are still here, that the people you love are still here, that the morning is coming whether you earned it or not, that a bad cup of coffee from a thermos in a government vehicle in the Montana dawn is, in the final accounting, something, is in fact enough. The mountains fell away on either side as the road descended. Neither of them spoke for a long time. That was fine. It had always been fine between them, the silence that wasn't empty. The kind that meant both people were present and neither of them needed to fill it. Garrett drove. Riva watched the valley open up ahead of them, the snow and the gray morning and the long flat distance of it after hours of compressed dark forest. She was going home not to a place exactly, to a person, to the particular quality of being known by someone who had been paying attention since before you knew yourself, and finding, after 3 years of carrying everything alone, that the weight distributed differently when someone else was in the room, not gone, just distributed. That was enough for now. That was everything.